The Battle of Tung Xoai was a major battle fought during the National Liberation Front's summer offensive of 1965 as part of the Vietnam War. The battle took place in Phoc Long Province, South Vietnam, between June 9 and 13, 1965. In 1964, General Nguyen Khan gained control of the South Vietnamese government after General Duong Van Minh was overthrown in a military coup. Although General Khan was able to gain control of the military junta, he failed to garner support from the civilian population when he implemented various laws which limited the freedoms of the South Vietnamese people. He then had a falling out with the Catholic faction within his own government, when he became increasingly reliant on the Buddhist movement to hold on to power. Consequently, on February 20, 1965, General Khan was ousted from power and was forced to leave South Vietnam forever. The political instability in Saigon gave North Vietnamese leaders in Hanoi an opportunity to step up their military campaign in the South. They believed the South Vietnamese government was able to survive because it still had a strong military to combat the growing influence of the Viet Cong. With the summer campaign of 1965, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces aimed to inflict significant losses on the South Vietnamese military. In Phoc Long Province, the Communist summer offensive culminated in the Thong Xoai campaign. The fight for Thong Xoai began on the evening of June 9, 1965, when the Viet Cong 272nd Regiment attacked and captured the civilian Irregular Defense Group and U.S. Special Forces camp there. In response to the sudden Viet Cong assault, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam Joint General Staff ordered the ARVN 1st Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, to retake Thong Xoai district. They arrived on the battlefield on June 10, but were quickly overwhelmed by the Viet Cong 271st Regiment near Tuan Lai. Later that day, Thong Xoai was recaptured by the ARVN 52nd Ranger Battalion, who had survived an ambush while marching towards the district. On June 11, further South Vietnamese reinforcements arrived in the form of the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion. The South Vietnamese paratroopers, while searching for survivors of the 1st Battalion in the Tuan Lai rubber plantation, were defeated in a deadly ambush by the Viet Cong. On June 13, U.S. Army General William Westmoreland decided to insert elements of the U.S. By that time, however, the Viet Cong had already withdrawn from the battlefield, so the U.S. paratroopers were ordered to return to base without a fight. Background. In January 1964, General Khan ousted General Duong Van Minh as the leader of South Vietnam's military junta in a bloodless coup. Although Khan had made considerable efforts to consolidate his power, opposition to his rule began to grow as he tightened censorship laws, banned protests and allowed police arbitrary search and imprisonment powers. Khan drafted a new constitution, which would have expanded his power within the military junta. In response to General Khan's political maneuvers, the South Vietnamese people, predominantly Buddhists, held large demonstrations in the cities calling for an end to the draconian laws which had limited the people's political freedom. Fearing that his power could be weakened by those demonstrations, General Khan immediately repealed his constitution and new police powers. He promised to reinstate civilian rule and remove members of the Catholic-based CN Lao from power. Internally, the concessions made by General Khan had the effect of unsettling Catholic offices such as Nguyen Van Chieu and Trn Thien Kim, because they were concerned by what they perceived to be the handing of power to Buddhist leaders. Subsequently, General Kim fell out with General Khan over policy issues along religious lines. Even though an alliance between both men had enabled Khan to remove General Minh from power, as military support for his regime diminished, Khan had to rely upon civilian Buddhist activists to maintain power. For the Americans, Khan's increased reliance on the Buddhists was a cause for concern. because the Buddhists favored a political resolution to the conflict with the Communists. Thus, by the end of 1964, the Americans looked for someone to overthrow Khan, in order to continue the military effort against the Communists. On February 20, 1965, Khan was finally removed from power, and he was forced to leave South Vietnam. From the Communist perspective, even though South Vietnam was plagued by political instability, it still had a strong army to resist the Viet Cong. So shortly after the Binh Gia campaign, North Vietnamese leaders reached a resolution to launch a summer offensive, to destroy the regular units of the South Vietnamese military. During the early stages of the Communist summer campaign, Viet Cong forces in Quang Dai province successfully destroyed a South Vietnamese task force, led by the ARVN 51st Infantry Regiment, in the village of Ba Gia. Following their victory at Ba Gia, the National Liberation Front turned its attention to the Mekong Delta region. To prepare for their next offensive, Major General Le Trong Tan was given the task of directing Viet Cong military operations in the provinces of Phoc Long, Binh Phoc. For the first time, the newly created Viet Cong 273rd and 274th Regiments was ordered to join the 271st and 272nd Regiments on the battlefield. Their objective was to destroy the regular units of the South Vietnamese military, and eliminate the strategic hamlets to enlarge what North Vietnam viewed as liberated zones. Prelude. Since May 1965, the Viet Cong offensive in Phoc Long province had been in full swing. Beginning on May 10, the Viet Cong 271st Regiment, supported by the 840th Battalion and local sapper units, attacked the district town of Phoc Long, capital of the province. Simultaneously, the Viet Cong 272nd Regiment overran South Vietnamese government positions in the subsector of Phoc Binh. During their brief occupation of Phoc Long district, the Viet Cong destroyed several major strategic hamlets in the surrounding areas, such as Ba Ra, Tuan Kiem, Tuan Loi, Phu Riang, Da Kia, Bu Dop, Duc Bon and Song Bi. In response to the Viet Cong occupation of Phoc Long district, the ARVN 36th Ranger Battalion was ordered by the ARVN Joint General Staff to recapture government positions there. On May 11, 2 companies from the battalion sustained heavy casualties in battles with Viet Cong units positioned along Interprovincial Road 13 and National Highway 14. On May 12, the Viet Cong 271st Regiment and other support units withdrew from Phoc Long district. In the Phoc Binh subsector, the Viet Cong 272nd Regiment were able to overrun South Vietnamese government positions within 25 minutes, and they claimed to have killed 115 South Vietnamese soldiers in the process at 9 a.m. on May 11. The ARVN 34th Ranger Battalion was airlifted into a small town located about 14 kilometers away from Phoc Binh in the southeast. As the ARVN 34th Ranger Battalion marched upward towards Phoc Binh, the Viet Cong 272nd and 273rd Regiment was ordered to destroy the South Vietnamese Rangers. However, by the time the 272nd Regiment arrived at the South Vietnamese staging area, the Rangers had already pulled out and successfully recaptured Phoc Binh. Meanwhile, on May 15, the Viet Cong 274th Regiment defeated 2 South Vietnamese regional force companies along Route 20, and destroyed 20 vehicles in the process. After those operations in Phoc Long district and Phoc Binh subsector, the Viet Cong 9th Division was ordered to attack Thong Xoai. In 1965, Thong Xoai was a district town situated at a road junction which connected Interprovincial Road 13, National Highway 1 and Highway 14. The district was defended by 200 local Vietnamese soldiers drawn from the 327th and 328th Militia Companies, and the 111th Regional Force Company. They were supported by one armored squadron and two 105 mm howitzers. There were also 200 Cambodian soldiers of a civilian irregular defense group, 11 United States Army Special Forces personnel, and 9 U.S. Navy Seabees. Prior to the battle, the U.S. Special Forces had assumed control of Thong Xoai's defenses. They stepped up guard and patrol activities, and ordered the construction of new defensive fortifications around the district headquarters, the Special Forces camp, and the armored and artillery positions on the eastern side of the district. Battle. On the evening of June 9, 1965, the Viet Cong made final preparations for their assault on Thong Xoai. While the Viet Cong assembled their formations, U.S.-led forces inside the Special Forces camp were suddenly placed on alert, forcing the Viet Cong to commence their attack 70 minutes earlier than scheduled. At 11:30 p.m. Viet Cong heavy mortar rounds began to fall on South Vietnamese and American positions around Thong Xoai, soon followed by an infantry assault led by the 272nd Regiment. During the initial assault, the Viet Cong sustained heavy casualties as they tried to navigate through the surrounding minefields and barbed wire fences, which they had failed to pick up during previous reconnaissance missions. At about 1:30 a.m., two helicopter gunships from the U.S. Army's 118th Aviation Company were dispatched to support the Special Forces camp. They fired on the Viet Cong around the compound, and returned to base only after their weapons load was emptied. At around 2:30 a.m., the Americans and a few of the Cambodian soldiers retreated to the district headquarters, where the local troops were holding out. Meanwhile, at Bien Hoa Air Base, all flight crews of the 118th Aviation Company were on the flight line preparing for combat assault at first light. By that time, however, the Viet Cong had captured the Special Forces compound, and they began massing for an attack on the district headquarters. While fighting raged inside the district, all flyable aircraft from the 118th Aviation Company flew out from Bien Hoa to Phoc Vinh, a small town about 30 kilometers from Thong Xoai. From Phoc Vinh, the 1st contingent of the ARVN 1st Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, was airlifted into the battlefield. At around 8 a.m., the UH-1 formations of the 118th Aviation Company descend on the landing zone near the Tuan Li rubber plantation, about 4 kilometers north of Thong Xoai. They immediately began to receive fire from bunkers and foxholes surrounding the area. The South Vietnamese command believed the landing zone near Tuan Li would be ideal to land their troops, because it was distant enough that the Viet Cong would not find and engage them immediately. However, the Viet Cong had anticipated the South Vietnamese would land troops in the area, and had prepared for an ambush. As a result, after U.S. helicopters had departed from the landing zone, soldiers of the Viet Cong 271st Regiment immediately turned their attention on the South Vietnamese. Within 15 minutes, the main body of the ARVN 1st Battalion was completely destroyed. At around 11:55 a.m., the last remaining soldiers of the ARVN 1st Battalion were discharged near the original landing zone in Tuan Li, and they too were put out of action within 3 minutes of touching down on the field. During the afternoon, the Viet Cong had managed to destroy parts of the district headquarters building using their 57mm recoilless rifle. 2nd Lieutenant Williams then ordered 14 Americans inside the building, along with an equal number of Vietnamese women and children, to retreat to the artillery position located east of the town, where they continued their resistance. Late in the afternoon on June 10, the U.S. 118th Aviation Company was joined by other elements of the 145th Combat Aviation Battalion in their final sorties for the day, airlifting the ARVN 52nd Ranger Battalion from Phoc Vinh into Thong Xoai, with the objective of recapturing the road junction and the Special Forces camp. Following their last mission, the 118th Aviation Company immediately returned to Bien Hoa. During the first day of heavy fighting, every helicopter in the unit had sustained damage, including the loss of one helicopter and its entire crew. At 3:20 p.m. the ARVN 52nd Ranger Battalion were discharged on a landing zone about 3 kilometers south of Thong Xoai, as the South Vietnamese Rangers marched towards the town center. Their lead company was decimated in an ambush mounted by elements of the Viet Cong 271st Regiment. Undeterred by the strength of the Viet Cong, they continued their march towards the district. On the night of June 10, the battalion began attacking Viet Cong positions around the Special Forces camp, and they gradually recaptured the compound and much of the town. The Viet Cong eventually launched a counter-attack in an attempt to win back the lost ground, but they failed to dislodge the soldiers of the ARVN 52nd Ranger Battalion. The next morning, on June 11, the 118th Aviation Company was back at full strength in Phoc Vinh. Like the previous day, they flew air support and airlifted further reinforcements from the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion. After the South Vietnamese paratroopers were dropped off on a soccer field, the 118th Aviation Company started large-scale evacuation of South Vietnamese casualties. In contrast to the previous day, the 118th Aviation Company encountered only isolated rearguard actions. Just before the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion landed on the battlefield, the Viet Cong had intercepted a radio conversation between the aforementioned unit and the 52nd Ranger Battalion in the district center. Several months earlier, the 7th Airborne Battalion was involved in the battle at Bin Gia, so they vowed to avenge the loss of their comrades. Thus, from the soccer field, the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion marched up to Tuan Lai, against only light opposition. The South Vietnamese paratroopers arrived at the area where the first group of the ARVN 1st Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, was dropped off, and they collected 7 survivors and 55 bodies. In the afternoon, as elements of the 7th Airborne Battalion moved through the Tuan Lai rubber plantation to search for remnants of the second group of the ARVN 1st Battalion, the Viet Cong 271st Regiment started attacking the South Vietnamese paratroopers in a manner which had characterized earlier ambushes, taking advantage of the poor weather conditions that had limited U.S. On the next day, the strength of the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion was reduced from 470 to just 159 soldiers. After the defeat of the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion, U.S. General William Westmoreland concluded that the Viet Cong still had the strength to continue the attacks on Thong Xoai. In contrast, South Vietnamese forces within the vicinity of Thong Xoai were severely depleted, and did not have sufficient strength to defeat the Viet Cong. Furthermore, there was only one remaining battalion in South Vietnam's strategic reserve, and it may not be enough to drive the Communists out from the area if it was committed. Westmoreland was unwilling to leave the Viet Cong with a position from which they could dominate Phoc Long Province. So, on June 13, he made the decision to insert U.S. combat forces. Subsequently, 738 men of the 1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade, were flown out of the staging area in Phoc Vinh. Elements of the 3rd Battalion, 319th Artillery also followed later in the day. Upon arrival at Phoc Vinh, the U.S. Army Task Force waited for 5 days. but it soon became apparent that the Viet Cong had withdrawn from the area and had no intention of holding territory. On June 18, the 503rd Infantry was ordered to return to base.